Hello and welcome. Do you want to successfully complete the C180 OA exam? Then you are in the right place. Our website has free questions and answers for the C180 OA exam. We know OA exams are tough, so our guides and practice questions are all free. With over 100 plus success stories, we have proven our videos will help you pass your exam on the first attempt. In this video, we will cover questions from social influence, memory systems, biological psychology, research methodology, relationship dynamics. So let's get started.
Question 1. A psychology student studying the history of the field reads that one early researcher established the first formal laboratory dedicated to the systematic study of conscious experience in Leipzig in 1879. This researcher used introspection to break mental experiences into their smallest sensory and emotional components. Which school of thought is the student learning about? Your options are A. Functionalism, B. Structuralism, C. Behaviorism, D. Humanism. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is B. Structuralism. B is correct because structuralism, founded by Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig in 1879, sought to analyze the mind by breaking conscious experience into its smallest components, such as sensations and feelings. The use of introspection to identify these basic elements is the defining method of structuralism. A is wrong because functionalism, associated with William James, asked why mental processes occur and how they help people adapt to their environments rather than cataloging building blocks of consciousness. C is wrong because behaviorism, championed by Watson and Skinner, rejected the study of conscious experience entirely and focused only on directly observable behavior. D is wrong because humanism, developed later by Maslow and Rogers, focused on free will, personal growth, and positive human potential rather than analyzing the components of consciousness. Structuralism was the first formal school of scientific psychology, founded by Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig in 1879. Its central mission was to break conscious experience down into its most basic elements, the same way a chemist reduces compounds into fundamental particles. In his Leipzig lab, Wundt had trained participants practice introspection, carefully observing their own inner mental events as they unfolded. A participant might bite into a peach and report not the fruit itself, but the distinct sensations and feelings composing the experience. Structuralists held that consciousness is built from two types of elements: sensations, arising from the sense organs, and feelings, the emotional qualities that color experience. Mapping how these elements combined was meant to reveal the underlying rules of the mind, much like a periodic table reveals the rules of chemistry. The most common mix-up is between structuralism and Gestalt psychology. Structuralism insisted on chopping experience into its smallest atoms. Gestalt took the opposite stance, arguing that the pattern matters more than the pieces, and that experience cannot be meaningfully reduced to parts. On any exam, the signal words Leipzig, 1879, introspection, and elements of consciousness all point to structuralism and its founder, Wilhelm Wundt. When the stem emphasizes wholeness or pattern instead, think Gestalt, and when it asks why mental processes help us adapt, think functionalism. Question 2. A graduate student is reading about an early American psychologist who set up the first psychology laboratory in the United States and asked why mental processes exist rather than what they are made of. This psychologist applied Darwin's idea of natural selection to mental characteristics. Which figure does this description match? Your options are A. Sigmund Freud, B. B.F. Skinner, C. Max Wertheimer, D. William James. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is D, William James. D is correct because William James founded American functionalism and set up the first psychology laboratory at Harvard, asking why humans think, feel, and behave as they do. He applied Darwin's theory of natural selection to mental characteristics and is often called the father of American psychology. A is wrong because Sigmund Freud developed psychodynamic theory and focused on unconscious conflicts and psychosexual development, not on adaptation or evolutionary functions of the mind. B is wrong because B.F. Skinner was a behaviorist who studied observable stimulus-response relationships and reinforcement schedules, not the evolutionary purpose of mental events. C is wrong because Max Wertheimer was the founder of Gestalt psychology and emphasized that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, not the adaptive function of the mind. Functionalism asked a question, structuralism never did, not what the mind is made of, but why it works the way it does. William James, working at Harvard in the late 1800s, built this school around the idea that mental processes exist because they help people adapt and survive. Both schools studied conscious experience in roughly the same era, but they asked fundamentally different questions. Structuralism catalogued the building blocks of the mind through introspection. Functionalism asked why those building blocks exist and how they help a person get through the day. The intellectual engine behind functionalism was Darwin's theory of natural selection. If physical traits that aid survival spread through populations, James and his contemporaries asked whether the same logic applies to mental traits, and concluded that it does. Functionalists studied mental processes like attention, memory, and emotion to understand what each one does for us. Attention filters out distractions. Memory lets past experience guide present choices. Emotion, like fear, triggers fast responses that kept ancestors alive. The most confusable concept is evolutionary psychology, which also draws on Darwin. Functionalism focused on how mental processes help individuals adapt within their own lifetime. Evolutionary psychology, a much later school, studies inherited cognitive strategies shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of human prehistory. Question 3. A psychology instructor explains that one school of thought rejected the study of conscious experience because researchers argued mental events could not be reliably observed or measured. Instead, this school focused on the relationships between stimuli, responses, and consequences. Which school is being described? Your options are A. Behaviorism, B. Psychodynamic theory, C. Gestalt psychology, D. Cognitive psychology. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is A. Behaviorism. A is correct because behaviorism, led by Watson, Thorndike, and Skinner, rejected introspection and the study of unobservable mental events. The school concentrated on stimulus-response associations and the consequences that shape voluntary behavior through reinforcement and punishment. B is wrong because psychodynamic theory, developed by Freud, emphasized unconscious mental events such as drives, conflicts, and defense mechanisms, which behaviorists explicitly rejected as unmeasurable. C is wrong because Gestalt psychology studied conscious perception and the organization of experience into wholes, which is the opposite of avoiding mental events. D is wrong because cognitive psychology emerged in the 1950s and embraced mental events like memory and attention by modeling the mind on the computer, which is incompatible with the behaviorist refusal to study them. Behaviorism became the dominant school of American psychology for much of the 20th century. Built on one core demand: psychology must study only what can be directly observed and measured. Thoughts, feelings, and consciousness were ruled out as unscientific. Earlier schools like structuralism and psychodynamic theory depended on introspection or interpretation of inner mental life. Thorndike, Watson, and Skinner argued that none of that was verifiable. Only stimulus and response, things any trained observer could record, belonged in a rigorous science. The two core mechanisms are classical conditioning, demonstrated by Pavlov, where a neutral stimulus becomes associated with a reflexive response, and operant conditioning, developed by Skinner, where behavior is shaped by its consequences. Rewards increase it, unpleasant outcomes decrease it. Behaviorism and cognitive psychology are the two schools most often confused on exams. Behaviorism rejected internal mental processes entirely and treated the mind as a black box. Cognitive psychology, emerging in the 1950s and 60s, embraced mental events like memory, attention, and information processing. When an exam stem mentions stimuli, responses, reinforcement, punishment, or names like Watson, Skinner, or Pavlov, behaviorism is the target. If it mentions hidden drives or unconscious conflicts instead, think psychodynamic, why or behaviorism explicitly rejected all of that. Question 4. A counselor explains to a new client that her therapeutic approach is rooted in the belief that all people possess inner goodness, free will, and a drive toward personal growth, and that her job is to provide acceptance without conditions. Which school of psychological thought best matches this counselor's framework? Your options are A. Structuralism, B. Behaviorism, C. Humanism, D. Functionalism. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is C. Humanism. C is correct because humanism, developed by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, emphasizes innate goodness, free will, personal growth, and the therapist's provision of unconditional positive regard. The counselor's framework fits humanism directly. A is wrong because structuralism focused on analyzing the components of conscious experience through introspection and had no clinical or therapeutic orientation. B is wrong because behaviorism treats clients by modifying observable behavior through reinforcement and punishment rather than by trusting an innate drive toward growth. D is wrong because functionalism studied why mental processes exist and how they aid adaptation, but did not center on personal growth or unconditional acceptance. Humanistic psychology emerged in the mid-20th century as a direct challenge to behaviorism and psychodynamic theory. Its founders, Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, believed both schools missed something essential about what it means to be human. Behaviorism reduced people to conditioned habits shaped by reinforcement. Psychodynamic theory focused on unconscious conflicts patients couldn't directly access. Humanists argued both views ignored the distinctively human capacity for free choice and self-directed growth. Maslow captured this idea in his famous hierarchy. Basic needs like food and safety must be satisfied before higher needs like belonging, esteem, and self-actualization can come into focus. The pyramid illustrates that growth unfolds in an ordered upward direction. Carl Rogers grounded his client-centered therapy in unconditional positive regard, accepting the client completely, without judgment or conditions. The therapist trusts the client's innate drive toward growth rather than diagnosing symptoms or prescribing behavior. On the exam, phrases like unconditional positive regard, self-actualization, and innate goodness all point to humanism. When a STEM describe a therapist who accepts a client without conditions and trusts their potential, humanism is almost always the answer. Question 5. A clinician describes a theory in which mental events are seen as products of continual push and pull interactions among conscious thoughts and hidden unconscious drives. The theory holds that early childhood experiences and unconscious conflicts shape adult behavior. Which framework is being described? Your options are A. Cognitive psychology, B. Psychodynamic theory, C. Evolutionary psychology, D. Behaviorism. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is B. Psychodynamic theory. B is correct because psychodynamic theory, originated by Sigmund Freud, defines mental events as ongoing interactions among conscious and unconscious forces. The framework emphasizes early childhood, hidden drives, and unconscious conflicts as the primary shapers of adult personality and behavior. A is wrong because cognitive psychology models the mind on a computer and studies conscious information processing such as memory and attention, not unconscious drives. C is wrong because evolutionary psychology argues that natural selection has built specific cognitive strategies into the brain and looks at adaptive value rather than unconscious conflict. D is wrong because behaviorism deliberately avoided mental concepts altogether and would reject the notion of unconscious drives as scientifically meaningless. Psychodynamic theory holds that most of what drives our behavior operates outside of conscious awareness. Freud developed this framework while treating patients whose physical symptoms had no medical explanation, pointing instead to buried psychological conflicts. Freud pictured the mind as an iceberg. Conscious thoughts are only the visible tip, while the vast unconscious mass below the surface, holding repressed memories, childhood experiences, and instinctual drives, is what truly shapes behavior. Freud described three interacting structures. The id demands immediate satisfaction of instinctual drives. The superego enforces morality by internalizing parental and cultural rules. The ego mediates between the two, balancing desire, morality, and the limits of reality. Picture someone walking past a bakery while hungry but short on money. The ID says, "Buy the pastry now." The superego says that's irresponsible. The ego finds a compromise: walk past today, allow a small treat after payday. Freud argued all behavior emerges from exactly this kind of internal negotiation. The most common mix-up is confusing psychodynamic theory with cognitive therapy. Psychodynamic theory targets unconscious causes and repressed conflict the client cannot directly access. Cognitive therapy works with conscious thoughts the client can identify and reframe. The key signal: if a stem mentions repression or hidden drives, think Freud. Question 6. A researcher wants to determine whether a new study technique causes higher test scores. She randomly assigns one group of students to use the new technique and another group to study as usual, then compares their exam results. Which type of research design has she used? Your options are A. Naturalistic observation, B. Correlational research, C. Case study, D. Experimental research. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Experimental research. D is correct because experimental research involves deliberate manipulation of an independent variable, in this case the study technique, while controlling other factors through random assignment to experimental and control groups. This design is the only one that can establish a causal relationship. A is wrong because naturalistic observation involves watching behavior in its real-world setting without intervention, which contradicts the deliberate manipulation described. B is wrong because correlational research measures the relationship between two existing variables without manipulating either, so it cannot determine cause and effect. C is wrong because a case study involves deep, detailed examination of a single individual or group, not the comparison of two randomly assigned groups. Experimental research is the only method in psychology that can establish a true causal relationship between variables. Understanding why requires looking at its core logic and what makes it different from every other design. Every experiment has three essential components: the independent variable the researcher deliberately manipulates, the dependent variable that is measured for change, and random assignment, which scatters pre-existing differences evenly across groups, so the only systematic difference is the manipulation itself. Picture a psychologist randomly assigning 100 participants into two groups. The experimental group uses a mindfulness app. The control group does not. Both groups are measured before and after, and because random assignment made the groups comparable at the start, any difference in anxiety at the end can be causally attributed to the app. The key exam distinction is this: correlational studies measure variables that already exist and find patterns, while experimental studies create the difference deliberately through manipulation and random assignment. If a STEM describes observing a pattern, think correlation. If it describes assigning participants to conditions, think experimentation. No matter how strong a correlation looks, without manipulation, control groups, and random assignment, causation cannot be claimed. That is what makes the experiment the gold standard in psychological research. Question 7. Before a university researcher can begin a study involving human participants, the proposal must be reviewed by a committee that evaluates potential risks, benefits, and ethical safeguards. What is this committee called? Your options are A. American Psychological Association, B. Ethics and Research Council, C. Institutional Review Board, D. Department of Subject Protection. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is C. Institutional Review Board. C is correct because the Institutional Review Board, commonly abbreviated as IRB, is the committee responsible for reviewing research proposals involving human participants. It evaluates risks, benefits, informed consent procedures, and other ethical safeguards before a study can proceed. A is wrong because the American Psychological Association sets broad ethical standards for the field, but does not review individual research proposals at universities. B is wrong because there is no such body as the Ethics in Research Council. It is not a recognized term in the psychological research literature. D is wrong because the Department of Subject Protection is not a real entity in psychological research and does not exist as a review committee. The Institutional Review Board, or IRB, is a committee at every research institution that must approve any study involving human participants before data collection can begin. Its authority and structure grew directly out of historical abuses in research. Landmark abuses, including the Tuskegee syphilis study and wartime experiments, demonstrated that researchers could not self-regulate. By the 1970s, the U.S. government required independent ethical review for all federally funded human subjects research, and the IRB became the enforcing body at each institution. The board evaluates 4 key dimensions: whether benefits outweigh risks, whether consent forms fully inform participants, how confidential data will be stored and protected, and whether extra safeguards are in place for vulnerable groups like children or prisoners. A critical distinction: informed consent is the document a participant signs after learning the study's procedures and risks. The IRB is the committee that reviews whether that document, and all other protections, are adequate before any research can begin. The APA sets broad professional ethics for the field. The IRB is a local committee reviewing specific proposals at one institution. Any exam STEM describing a committee approving research before it starts is pointing to the IRB. Question 8. A psychologist designs a study in which she varies the amount of caffeine given to participants and measures their reaction time on a computer task. Which terms correctly identify the variables in the study? Your options are A. Caffeine is the dependent variable and reaction time is the independent variable. B. Caffeine is the independent variable and reaction time is the dependent variable. C. Both caffeine and reaction time are independent variables. D. Both caffeine and reaction time are confounding variables. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is B. Caffeine is the independent variable and reaction time is the dependent variable. B is correct because the independent variable is the factor that the researcher deliberately manipulates, in this case the amount of caffeine. The dependent variable is the outcome that depends on the independent variable, in this case the reaction time measured after the caffeine is administered. Is wrong because this option reverses the definitions. Reaction time cannot be the independent variable because the researcher does not manipulate it. It is observed as the result. C is wrong because a study can have only one independent variable for each manipulation, and reaction time is being measured as an outcome rather than manipulated. D is wrong because confounding variables are unintended factors that vary alongside the independent variable and threaten the study's validity, not the variables the researcher is directly working with. Every experiment in psychology is built around a cause and effect relationship between two variables. Understanding exactly which variable plays which role is what separates a well-designed study from a tangle of measurements. The independent variable is the factor the researcher deliberately manipulates, e.g., it is the proposed cause. The dependent variable is the outcome that is measured to detect whether a change occurred. It is the proposed effect. For example, if a researcher tests whether caffeine speeds up reaction times, caffeine dose is the independent variable. The researcher controls it. Reaction time is the dependent variable. The researcher simply observes and records it. Random assignment holds everything else constant, so the effect can be attributed to caffeine alone. Exam questions telegraph which variable is which through specific language. When you see words like manipulated or experimental treatment, that is the independent variable. Words like outcome or measure point to the dependent variable. Always ask, what did the researcher actively change and what did she passively record? Whenever you are unsure, return to this simple rule. The variable the researcher controls is independent, and the variable the researcher observes is dependent. Get that distinction right, and the rest of experimental design falls into place. Question 9. A community health researcher prepares forms that explain the purpose of her study, the procedures involved, potential risks and benefits, the right to withdraw at any time, and how privacy will be protected. Participants must sign these forms before joining the study. Which ethical principle does this practice satisfy? Your options are A. Reliability, B. Random assignment, C. Operational definition, D. Informed consent. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is D. Informed consent. D is correct because informed consent requires that potential participants be told what they will be asked to do, the possible risks and benefits, their right to withdraw without penalty, and how confidentiality is maintained. Signing the form documents that the participant has agreed under these conditions. A is wrong because reliability refers to whether a measurement produces consistent results across repeated administrations, not to participant protections. B is wrong because random assignment is a procedure for placing participants into experimental or control groups by chance, unrelated to disclosure of study details. C is wrong because an operational definition specifies how a concept will be measured or manipulated in a study, which is a methodological rather than an ethical requirement. Informed consent is the foundational ethical requirement before any person can participate in psychological research. It traces back to historical abuses that made clear voluntary agreement isn't just good practice. Sarat Sailans, it's a moral obligation. Valid consent has 3 pillars. It must be informed, meaning genuine understanding, not just a signature. It must be voluntary, free from pressure or manipulation. And it must be competent. The person must have the cognitive capacity to decide. The consent process involves both a written document and a conversation. The document covers the study's purpose, procedures, risks, benefits, compensation, the right to withdraw at any time without penalty, confidentiality protections, and contact information. The conversation gives the participant a real chance to ask questions before deciding. The most common exam confusion is mixing up informed consent with debriefing. Informed consent happens before the study begins, when the participant is deciding whether to take part. Debriefing happens after the study ends, when the researcher explains what was actually studied and addresses any deception. Watch for phrases like right to withdraw, explain the procedures, or signed agreement. Those signal informed consent. If the scenario describes the end of a study where the researcher explains what really happened, that's debriefing, not consent. Question 10. A psychologist finds that as the number of hours students spend on social media each day increases, their reported levels of life satisfaction decrease. Which type of relationship best describes this finding? Your options are A. Positive correlation, B. Causal relationship, C. Negative correlation, D. Zero correlation. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Negative correlation. C is correct because a negative correlation occurs when one variable increases as the other decreases. Hours on social media rising while life satisfaction falls fits this inverse pattern exactly. A is wrong because a positive correlation would mean both variables move in the same direction, which is the opposite of what the study found. B is wrong because a correlational study cannot establish that one variable causes a change in the other. The data only show that the variables are statistically related. D is wrong because a zero correlation would mean no statistical relationship between the variables, but the description clearly indicates a systematic inverse pattern. Correlational research is a non-experimental design where researchers measure variables that already exist in participants and look for statistical relationships between them. No manipulation, no assigned groups, just naturally occurring data. The core tool is the correlation coefficient. A positive value means the two variables move in the same direction, while a negative value means they move oppositely. The closer the coefficient is to 1 or -1, the stronger the relationship. Picture a researcher plotting students' daily social media hours against their life satisfaction scores. The line of best fit slopes downward, a negative correlation. This tells us the two measurements are inversely related, but nothing about which one causes the other. A statistical association always has at least 3 possible explanations. A causes B causes A, or a third variable causes both. Ice cream sales and drowning deaths are positively correlated, but some are where the independently drives both. Correlation can never rule out the third variable problem. If a study describes measuring existing variables and looking for a statistical pattern, that is correlational research. If it describes manipulating a variable and measuring the result, that is experimental. Correlation shows a relationship exists, never that one thing caused another. Question 11. A patient is diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, which involves the death of neurons that produce a particular neurotransmitter associated with motivation, reward, and voluntary movement. Which neurotransmitter is most relevant to this disorder? Your options are A. Dopamine, B. Serotonin, C. GABA, D. Acetylcholine. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is A, dopamine. A is correct because dopamine is the neurotransmitter most directly involved in motivation, reward, learning, and voluntary movement. Parkinson's disease is characterized by the death of dopamine-producing neurons, leading to tremors, rigidity, and difficulty initiating movement. B is wrong because serotonin regulates mood and sleep, and shortages are linked to depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, not to the motor symptoms of Parkinson's. C is wrong because GABA is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter and is implicated in anxiety, epilepsy, and Huntington's disease rather than Parkinson's. D is wrong because acetylcholine is involved in muscle contraction, memory, and arousal, and shortages relate more closely to Alzheimer's disease than to Parkinson's. Dopamine is one of the brain's most important neurotransmitters, involved in far more than just pleasure. It acts as a chemical messenger that shapes motivation, movement, attention, and learning across several distinct brain circuits. Dopamine is produced in midbrain regions and travels along three key pathways. The nigrostriatal pathway controls voluntary movement, the mesocortical pathway supports attention and planning, and the mesolimbic pathway drives reward learning. Disruptions in dopamine signaling underlie several disorders. Parkinson's disease results from dying dopamine neurons, schizophrenia from excess dopamine activity, and ADHD from dysregulation. Drugs like cocaine increase dopamine, while antipsychotics like chlorpromazine block its receptors. The most common exam confusion is between dopamine and serotonin. If a question mentions movement disorders, reward, or psychotic symptoms, dopamine is the answer. If it mentions persistent sadness, anxiety, or obsessions, think serotonin instead. Whenever you see a stem describing loss of motor control, motivation problems, or psychotic symptoms, dopamine is almost always the key. Its role as the brain's go signal spans movement, attention, and the reinforcement of everything worth repeating. Question 12. A patient experiences damage to the back of her head from a fall. Afterwards, she has difficulty processing visual information and recognizing objects she sees. Which lobe of the brain has most likely been affected? Your options are A. Frontal lobe, B. Parietal lobe, C. Occipital lobe, D. Temporal lobe. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is C, occipital lobe. C is correct because the occipital lobe, located at the back of the head, is dedicated almost entirely to processing visual information. Damage here results in vision difficulties ranging from partial blindness to problems identifying objects. A is wrong because the frontal lobe, behind the forehead, is responsible for planning, decision-making, motor control, and reasoning, not for vision. B is wrong because the parietal lobe at the top rear of the brain handles touch, spatial awareness, and arithmetic, and damage that would not specifically impair vision. D is wrong because the temporal lobe processes sound, language comprehension, and visual memory storage, but is not the primary site of visual processing itself. The occipital lobe sits at the very back of the skull and is the brain's dedicated visual processing center. It's the smallest of the four cortical lobes, but it handles an enormous workload, turning raw signals from the eyes into coherent images. Light entering the eye is converted to neural signals by the retina, then routed through the thalamus to the primary visual cortex, called V1. At the very back of the occipital lobe. From V1, signals fan out to specialized regions that analyze edges, colors, motion, and depth before assembling them into a unified scene. Specialized subregions within the occipital lobe each handle a distinct visual feature, color, motion, and the shapes of edges and depth. These parallel streams of analysis converge to produce the single, seamless visual experience we call seeing. The key exam distinction the occipital lobe handles early: sensory vision, detecting edges, color, and motion. The temporal lobe takes over for object and face recognition. The parietal lobe handles spatial awareness and touch. Damage at the back of the skull with basic visual loss points squarely to the occipital lobe. A simple rule ties it together. The occipital lobe is located at the back of the head because it sits at the start of the brain's visual pipeline. When a patient loses basic sight after a posterior head injury, the occipital lobe is the first place to look. Question 13. After a serious accident, a man can recall events from before the accident but cannot form new long-term memories. He meets his nurse every day as if for the first time. Damage to which brain structure is most consistent with this pattern? Your options are amygdala, B. hippocampus, C. cerebellum, D. hypothalamus. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is B. hippocampus. B is correct because the hippocampus plays a key role in converting short-term memories into long-term storage. Damage to it produces anterograde amnesia, in which a person can recall the past but cannot form new lasting memories of events that occur after the injury. A is wrong because the amygdala is involved in processing strong emotions such as fear and anger, not the formation of new declarative memories. C is wrong because the cerebellum manages physical coordination, balance, and timing. So damage produces motor and balance problems rather than memory loss. D is wrong because the hypothalamus regulates eating, drinking, body temperature, and hormone release, none of which directly involves forming new memories. The hippocampus is a small, seahorse-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobes, and despite its size, it's one of the most critical structures in all of neuroscience. Sitting inside the temporal lobe, the hippocampus receives perceptual and emotional details from across the cortex and binds them into a unified memory trace, a process called memory consolidation. Specifically, the hippocampus binds scattered details into a single memory, consolidates it from short-term into long-term storage, and tags it for conscious retrieval later. It is especially vital for episodic and declarative memories. The most common exam confusion is between the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus handles forming new memories. The amygdala handles emotion and fear. Hippocampal damage causes anterograde amnesia, while amygdala damage impairs fear responses and emotional recognition. When a question describes a patient whose old memories are intact but who cannot form any new ones, the hippocampus is always the answer. Old memories preserved, new memories impossible. That is the hallmark of hippocampal damage. Question 14. A driver narrowly avoids a collision on the highway. Within seconds his heart races, his pupils dilate, his breathing accelerates, and digestion shuts down. Which division of the nervous system is responsible for this response? Your options are A. Parasympathetic nervous system, B. Somatic nervous system, C. Central nervous system, D. Sympathetic nervous system. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is D. Sympathetic nervous system. D is correct because the sympathetic nervous system, a branch of the autonomic nervous system, prepares the body for fight, flight, or freeze responses. It accelerates the heart, dilates pupils, speeds breathing, and suppresses digestion to mobilize energy for an emergency. A is wrong because the parasympathetic nervous system counteracts the sympathetic response, calming the body and supporting rest and digestion after the threat has passed. B is wrong because the somatic nervous system controls voluntary movements of skeletal muscles and sensory information from the body, not the involuntary stress response described. C is wrong because the central nervous system is composed of the brain and spinal cord and coordinates overall function, but the specific fight or flight reaction is driven by the sympathetic branch of the autonomic system. The sympathetic nervous system is one branch of the autonomic nervous system, the system that controls involuntary bodily functions without conscious awareness. Its core job is to flip the body from rest into readiness the instant the brain detects a threat. When the sympathetic branch fires, it coordinates a full body response at once. The heart speeds up, pupils dilate, breathing accelerates, glucose floods the bloodstream, and digestion shuts down, all mediated by the neurotransmitter noradrenaline acting on receptors throughout the body. The sympathetic and parasympathetic branches work in direct opposition. The sympathetic system accelerates the body into emergency readiness, fight, flight, or freeze. The parasympathetic system decelerates, restoring the body to its calm, baseline, rest and digest state. The most common exam confusion is between the sympathetic and somatic branches. The sympathetic branch controls smooth muscle, glands, and internal organs automatically. The somatic branch controls deliberate skeletal muscle movement. Involuntary stress responses point to sympathetic. Conscious movement of limbs points to somatic. When an exam stem describes sudden physiological arousal, racing heart, dilated pupils, suppressed digestion, that's your signal, sympathetic nervous system. If the response is involuntary and internal, sympathetic wins every time. Question 15. An endocrinologist tells a patient that one particular gland sits at the base of the brain, takes instructions from the hypothalamus, and releases hormones that control most other glands in the body. Which gland is being described? Your options are A. Pituitary gland, B. Thyroid gland, C. Pancreas, D. Adrenal gland. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is A. Pituitary gland. A is correct because the pituitary gland sits below the hypothalamus at the base of the brain and is often called the master gland because its hormones direct the activity of most other endocrine glands. It also releases growth hormones, endorphins, and fluid-regulating hormones. B is wrong because the thyroid, located at the base of the neck, controls metabolic rate by regulating growth and cellular metabolism rather than directing other glands. C is wrong because the pancreas is an abdominal organ that regulates blood sugar through insulin and aids digestion, not a master gland for endocrine control. D is wrong because the adrenal gland releases hormones such as cortisol and adrenaline that help the body manage stress, but it responds to pituitary signals rather than directing other glands. The pituitary gland is a pea-sized structure at the base of the brain, yet it controls the activity of most other endocrine glands in the body. Understanding how it works and how it differs from the hypothalamus is essential for the exam. The gland has two distinct lobes. The anterior lobe produces hormones that stimulate other glands, including thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, and growth hormone. The posterior lobe stores and releases oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, which are actually made by the hypothalamus. When the pituitary releases its hormones into the bloodstream, the thyroid, adrenal glands, and gonads all respond. This cascade is how a single small gland coordinates growth, metabolism, stress response, and reproduction across the entire body. The key exam nuance is the hierarchy. The hypothalamus sends instructions down to the pituitary, making it technically the boss, The pituitary then relays those instructions outward to the rest of the endocrine system. If a question describes a gland that directs other glands from the base of the brain, it is describing the pituitary. On the exam, watch for phrases like master gland, base of the brain, or controls other glands. Those all point to the pituitary. If the question instead emphasizes metabolic rate or thyroid hormones directly, think thyroid, not pituitary. Question 16. A radiologist scanning an image quickly identifies a small abnormality that a first-year medical student misses entirely. The radiologist uses her years of training and expectations about what to look for to interpret what she sees. Which type of processing best describes the radiologist's approach? Your options are A. Bottom-up processing, B. Top-down processing, C. Sensory adaptation, D. Absolute threshold. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is B. Top-down processing. B is correct because top-down processing is guided by prior knowledge, expectations, and experience that shape how raw sensory data is interpreted. The radiologist's expertise lets her recognize abnormalities that a novice missing the relevant knowledge would overlook. A is wrong because bottom-up processing is triggered solely by incoming sensory input without the influence of prior knowledge, the opposite of using expertise to guide interpretation. C is wrong because sensory adaptation describes how receptor cells become less responsive to a constant stimulus over time, which is unrelated to interpreting an image using expertise. D is wrong because absolute threshold refers to the smallest amount of stimulation that can be detected 50% of the time and does not describe the use of knowledge during perception. Top-down processing is how prior knowledge and expectation shape what we perceive. Rather than building meaning purely from raw sensory data, the brain uses what it already knows to interpret incoming signals, often filling in gaps before they are even noticed. Three things drive top-down processing: prior knowledge, expectations, and memory. The cortex sends predictive signals down to earlier sensory areas, biasing them toward patterns it has already learned to recognize. This is what makes perception fast enough to support real-time behavior. Consider an experienced radiologist scanning a chest X-ray. She and a first-year student are looking at the same image, the same raw sensory input, yet she spots an irregular mass almost instantly. Her years of training built a mental library of normal and abnormal patterns, and her brain uses that library to direct attention and interpret what it finds. Bottom-up processing builds perception from raw sensory data alone, with no influence from prior knowledge. Top-down processing does the opposite. It starts with what is already known and uses that to interpret incoming data. Most real perception involves both, but exam questions isolate one or the other. When an exam stem highlights expertise, expectation, or prior knowledge shaping perception, top-down processing is the answer. If it emphasizes filtering among competing stimuli, think selective attention instead, a related but distinct concept. Question 17. At a noisy reception, a woman is deep in conversation with one friend and barely registers the surrounding chatter. Suddenly, her own name is mentioned across the room, and her attention immediately shifts. Which phenomenon explains this attentional shift? Your options are A. Dichotic listening, B. Sensory adaptation, C. Top-down processing, D. Cocktail party phenomenon. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is D. Cocktail party phenomenon. D is correct because the cocktail party phenomenon describes the effect of tuning out background conversations while focused on one stimulus, only to suddenly hear something personally meaningful, such as one's own name, that breaks through the filter. A is wrong because dichotic listening refers to an experimental procedure in which different stimuli are presented to each ear and the listener must focus on one, which is a related but distinct concept. B is wrong because sensory adaptation describes the gradual decrease in receptor response to an unchanging stimulus, not the selective shift of attention based on meaning. C is wrong because top-down processing involves prior knowledge guiding perception more broadly and does not specifically explain the snap of attention to one's own name in background noise. The cocktail party phenomenon describes our ability to focus on one conversation in a noisy room while filtering out everything else, and yet still notice when our own name is spoken across the room. The mechanism involves two parallel processes. An active filter, linked to the prefrontal cortex, suppresses unattended channels so they don't reach full awareness. Simultaneously, a passive monitor scans those channels at a shallow level, ready to flag anything personally relevant. The passive monitor is tuned to personally salient signals. Your own name, your child's voice, or a sudden loud sound carry enough relevance to break through the filter and snap your attention to the unattended channel. Don't confuse this with dichotic listening, a lab procedure where different sounds are played to each ear through headphones. If the stem describes a crowded room and a name triggering an attention shift, that's the cocktail party phenomenon. Headphones and separate ear inputs point to dichotic listening instead. When an exam stem describes someone tuning out background chatter and suddenly noticing their own name, that's the textbook cocktail party phenomenon and selective attention with a personally relevant trigger. Question 18. A pedestrian sees a familiar face in a crowd and instantly recognizes an old colleague. The light entering her eyes triggers the same neural signals as any other face, but her brain quickly attaches meaning and identity to what she sees. The act of attaching meaning to that sensory input is best described as what? Your options are A. Perception, B. Sensation, C. Transduction, D. Habituation. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Perception. A is correct because perception is the brain's process of interpreting and giving meaning to raw sensory information. Recognizing the face as belonging to a specific person involves identifying the visual stimulus and connecting it to stored memory, which is perception rather than simple detection. B is wrong because sensation refers to the initial neural responses to physical energy striking receptor cells before any interpretation occurs. Seeing the face would be sensation, but recognizing it as the colleague would not. C is wrong because transduction is the conversion of physical energy into neural signals and is a step earlier than the perceptual process of attaching meaning. D is wrong because habituation is the gradual decrease in response to a repeated stimulus and is not involved in recognizing or interpreting a stimulus. Sensation and perception are two distinct stages in how your brain processes the world. Sensation is the raw physical input delivered by your sense organs. Light hitting the retina, sound waves entering the ear. Perception is what the brain does next, organizing, identifying, and giving meaning to those signals. The key distinction is that sensation is detection. A receptor cell simply fires when stimulated. Perception is interpretation. The brain takes that firing and recognizes an object, a face, or a word. Crucially, a person can have sensation without perception if the visual cortex is damaged. They see light and motion, but cannot identify what they're looking at. At the receptor level, transduction converts physical energy, light or sound, into neural signals. This is the very first step, happening before any signal reaches the brain. Perception comes much later, when the cortex matches those organized signals against stored memories and produces a recognized, meaningful experience. Exam questions signal perception, with words like recognition, interpretation, and identifying objects. If the stem describes a receptor cell converting energy into a nerve impulse, the answer is transduction, not perception. When recognition or meaning is involved, perception is almost always the relevant concept. Whenever a scenario describes someone recognizing or making sense of sensory input, like spotting a familiar face in a crowd, that is perception at work. Sensation delivers the raw data, perception delivers the meaning. Question 19. A researcher studying hearing places participants in a soundproof booth and gradually increases the volume of a tone until each participant can detect it half the time it is presented. The volume at which detection happens 50% of the time is which measurement? Your options are A. Difference threshold, B. Just noticeable difference, C. Absolute threshold, D. Sensory adaptation. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is C. Absolute threshold. C is correct because the absolute threshold is defined as the minimum amount of stimulation needed for an observer to detect a stimulus half of the time it is present. This 50% detection rate is the standard criterion in psychophysical research. A is wrong because a difference threshold is the smallest detectable change between two stimuli, not the minimum needed to detect a stimulus at all. B is wrong because A, just noticeable difference, is another name for the difference threshold and refers to comparing stimuli, not detecting a single stimulus from silence or absence. D is wrong because sensory adaptation describes the diminishing response of receptors to a constant stimulus over time, unrelated to the initial detection threshold. Absolute threshold is a core concept in psychophysics, the study of how physical stimuli translate into conscious experience. Understanding it precisely is what separates a correct answer from a common mistake. The absolute threshold is defined as the smallest amount of stimulus energy an observer detects half the time it is present. Crucially, it is not the level detected every single time. Human sensory detection is inherently variable, so 50% was chosen as the standardized boundary. In practice, a researcher presents tones of increasing volume across many trials and records when the observer responds. The volume at which detection reaches 50% of trials is recorded as that person's absolute threshold for that frequency. The most common exam confusion is mixing up absolute threshold and difference threshold. Absolute threshold asks, can you detect the stimulus at all? Difference threshold, also called the just noticeable difference, asks, can you detect a change between two stimuli? Whenever an exam stem uses phrases like half the time, 50% detection, or minimum stimulus energy, it is pointing directly to absolute threshold. That specific detail is your signal. Question 20. A man walks past a bakery and is suddenly flooded with vivid memories of his grandmother's kitchen from childhood. This strong link between smell and emotional memory occurs because the olfactory pathway connects directly to which brain region? Your options are A. Cerebellum, B. Limbic system, C. Medulla, D. Reticular formation. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Limbic system. B is correct because the olfactory pathway sends signals to the limbic system, which includes the hippocampus and amygdala. Because the limbic system handles both emotion and memory, smells often trigger vivid emotional memories far more readily than other senses. A is wrong because the cerebellum manages coordination and balance and is not involved in linking smell to emotional memory. C is wrong because the medulla controls automatic functions such as breathing and heart rate and has no role in associating odors with memories. D is wrong because the reticular formation regulates arousal and alertness rather than the connection between scent and emotional recall. The limbic system is a network of structures deep inside the brain, just beneath the cerebral cortex. It's one of the brain's oldest regions in evolutionary terms, and it's where emotion, memory, and basic bodily drives all come together. 3 key structures drive the limbic system. The hippocampus consolidates new memories and supports spatial navigation. The amygdala processes emotion, especially fear, and flags emotionally charged events for stronger storage. The hypothalamus regulates hunger, thirst, body temperature, and the release of stress hormones. On exams, each limbic structure maps to a distinct function. Hippocampus damage impairs forming new memories. Amygdala damage impairs fear responses and reading emotion in faces. Hypothalamus damage disrupts eating, drinking, or temperature regulation. Olfactory signals connect directly to limbic structures, bypassing routes other senses take. A scent like baking bread can simultaneously trigger the hippocampus to retrieve a memory, the amygdala to add emotional tone, and the hypothalamus to shift your body, all before conscious thought. Remember, the limbic system is the broad umbrella linking emotion, memory, and drives. When a question names a specific deficit, memory, fear, or a basic drive, it's pointing to one component within that system. Question 21. A dog trainer notices that her dog begins to drool every time he hears the sound of his food bag being opened, even before any food appears. This pattern, where a previously neutral sound now triggers an automatic physical response, is best explained by which type of learning? Your options are A. Classical conditioning, B. Operant conditioning, C. Observational learning, D. Cognitive learning. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is A. Classical conditioning. A is correct because classical conditioning, demonstrated by Ivan Pavlov, occurs when a neutral stimulus becomes paired with an unconditioned stimulus that produces a reflexive response. After enough pairings, the formerly neutral stimulus alone can trigger the response, exactly as the bag sound now triggers salivation. B is wrong because operant conditioning involves voluntary behavior shaped by rewards and punishments that follow the action, not the pairing of stimuli to produce an automatic reflexive response. C is wrong because observational learning happens when an individual watches and imitates another's behavior, which has nothing to do with the dog's automatic physical reaction to a sound. D is wrong because cognitive learning emphasizes mental processes such as thinking and problem solving rather than the formation of involuntary stimulus-response associations. Classical conditioning is one of psychology's most fundamental forms of learning, first described by Ivan Pavlov in the early 1900s. An organism learns to associate two stimuli until a previously neutral cue triggers an automatic, reflexive response on its own. No conscious choice required. The mechanism relies on 4 key terms. The unconditioned stimulus naturally produces a response, like food causing salivation. The unconditioned response is that automatic reaction. The conditioned stimulus is a neutral cue, like a bell, paired repeatedly with the unconditioned stimulus until it triggers the response alone. That learned reaction is the conditioned response. The exam trick is knowing which term is which. Find what already produces the response without any learning. That's the unconditioned stimulus, and its natural reaction is the unconditioned response. The neutral cue that gets paired with it becomes the conditioned stimulus, and the same response triggered by that cue alone is the conditioned response. Don't confuse classical conditioning with operant conditioning. Classical conditioning involves involuntary, reflexive responses triggered by stimuli that come before the response. Operant conditioning shapes voluntary behaviors through consequences that come after. If the stem describes a reflexive reaction to a learned cue, think classical conditioning. Watch for exam language like neutral stimulus paired with automatic response or reflexive reaction. Classical conditioning also underlies phobia treatments, where the goal is to extinguish the learned link between a feared stimulus and the fear response. Question 22. A teacher gives gold stars to students each time they complete homework on time. Over the semester, the rate of on-time submissions rises sharply. Which type of learning is the teacher applying? Your options are A. Classical conditioning, B. Sensitization, C. Operant conditioning, D. Habituation. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is C. Operant conditioning. C is correct because operant conditioning shapes voluntary behavior through consequences that follow it. By giving gold stars as a reward each time on-time submission occurs, the teacher uses positive reinforcement to increase the frequency of that voluntary behavior. A is wrong because classical conditioning involves pairing a neutral stimulus with one that already triggers an automatic involuntary response, which is not the teacher's strategy of rewarding voluntary action. B is wrong because sensitization refers to an increased response to a stimulus after repeated exposure to a stronger, often aversive stimulus, not the use of rewards to encourage chosen behavior. D is wrong because habituation is the gradual decrease in responsiveness to a stimulus over time and would predict reduced engagement, the opposite of the rise in homework completion. Operant conditioning is the process by which voluntary behaviors are shaped by their consequences. Unlike classical conditioning, which works on reflexes, operant conditioning applies to chosen actions, things like studying, cleaning a room, or following rules. The mechanism has 4 types. Positive reinforcement adds something desirable to increase a behavior. Negative reinforcement removes something unpleasant to increase a behavior. Positive punishment adds something unpleasant to decrease a behavior. Negative punishment removes something desirable to decrease a behavior. A classic example ties all 4 types together. A parent can give stickers for a clean room, stop nagging once cleaning begins, add chores for a messy room, or take away screen time. Each targets the same behavior using a different consequence. The key to distinguishing operant from classical conditioning is asking whether the behavior is voluntary or reflexive. Salivating or blinking in response to a cue is classical conditioning. Choosing to act because of expected rewards or punishments is operant conditioning. No matter what is added or removed, reinforcement always increases behavior and punishment always decreases it. Keep that principle clear and the 4 types fall into place. Question 23. A car beeps loudly until the driver fastens her seatbelt. Once she clicks it in, the beeping stops. Over time, she fastens her seatbelt as soon as she sits down to avoid the noise. Which operant conditioning concept best explains why her seatbelt behavior has increased? Your options are A. Positive reinforcement, B. Negative reinforcement, C. Positive punishment, D. Negative punishment. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is B. Negative reinforcement. B is correct because negative reinforcement increases a behavior by removing an unpleasant stimulus after the behavior occurs. Fastening the seatbelt removes the annoying beep, so the driver becomes more likely to perform that action quickly in the future. A is wrong because positive reinforcement involves adding a pleasant consequence to increase a behavior, but here something unpleasant is being taken away rather than something rewarding being added. C is wrong because positive punishment adds an aversive consequence to decrease a behavior, but seatbelt fastening is increasing, not decreasing. D is wrong because negative punishment takes away something desirable to decrease a behavior, which does not match the removal of an unpleasant noise that increases behavior. Negative reinforcement is one of the most misunderstood concepts in operant conditioning. The word negative means subtraction, not something bad, and reinforcement always means the behavior is getting stronger. The defining feature is that something unpleasant is taken away after a behavior, making that behavior more likely in the future. This captures both escape learning, where the discomfort is already present, and avoidance learning, where the organism prevents the discomfort from occurring at all. Picture a car that beeps until you buckle your seatbelt. Clicking the bolt stops the noise. That removal is the negative reinforcement. Over time, you buckle up the moment you sit down, shifting from escape learning to avoidance learning. The critical exam distinction is between negative reinforcement and punishment. Both involve unpleasant experiences, but they work in opposite directions. Negative reinforcement removes the aversive stimulus and increases the behavior. Punishment introduces or removes something to decrease the behavior. Whenever a STEM describes a behavior becoming more frequent because it ends or avoids something aversive, negative reinforcement is the answer. The behavior goes up and something unpleasant goes away. Question 24. A parent adds extra chores each time her teenager misses curfew. After several weeks, the teenager's curfew violations drop sharply. Which operant principle is the parent using? Your options are A. Negative reinforcement, B. Positive reinforcement, C. Negative punishment, D. Positive punishment. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Positive punishment. D is correct because positive punishment occurs when an unpleasant stimulus is added after an undesired behavior, with the result that the behavior decreases. Adding extra chores after curfew violations and seeing those violations drop fits the definition exactly. A is wrong because negative reinforcement removes an unpleasant stimulus to increase a behavior, but the parent is adding chores and trying to decrease violations. B is wrong because positive reinforcement adds a desired consequence to increase a behavior, but extra chores are not desirable and the goal is to decrease, not increase, the behavior. C is wrong because negative punishment removes a desirable item or privilege to decrease a behavior, such as taking away phone access, rather than adding an aversive task. Positive punishment is one of the 4 core consequences in operant conditioning. Understanding it deeply means understanding both words in the name and how it differs from the other 3 consequences. The word positive does not mean good, it means addition. The word punishment means the behavior is being suppressed. So positive punishment simply means an aversive stimulus is added after a behavior, making that behavior less likely to recur. The mechanism is direct. A behavior occurs. An aversive stimulus is added immediately afterward, and that consequence reduces how often the behavior happens again. For this to work effectively, the punishment must be swift, consistent, and aversive enough to deter the behavior. Keeping all 4 consequences straight is the key exam skill. Positive and negative reinforcement both increase behavior. Positive and negative punishment both decrease behavior. The critical trap is confusing positive punishment with negative reinforcement. Both involve aversive stimuli, but positive punishment adds the aversive stimulus while negative reinforcement removes it. When an exam STEM describes adding something unpleasant after a behavior, extra chores, a fine, a scolding, and the behavior decreases as a result, that is positive punishment. If instead a discomfort is removed to encourage a behavior, that is negative reinforcement. Question 25. A new puppy is being trained using small food treats as rewards. The trainer notes that the puppy does not need to learn that food is valuable. The appeal is built in. Which type of reinforcer is the food acting as? Your options are A. Primary reinforcer, B. Secondary reinforcer, C. Conditioned reinforcer, D. Token reinforcer. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is A. Primary reinforcer. A is correct because a primary reinforcer has innate biological value and does not require learning to be appealing. Food, water, and relief from pain are classic examples because they satisfy basic biological needs without prior conditioning. B is wrong because a secondary reinforcer acquires its value through learning and association with primary reinforcers, such as praise or money, which the puppy has not yet learned to value. C is wrong because a conditioned reinforcer is another name for a secondary reinforcer and depends on learned associations rather than built-in biological appeal. D is wrong because a token reinforcer is a specific type of secondary reinforcer used in token economies where the token itself has no intrinsic value and must be traded for something else. Reinforcement is the engine of operant conditioning, but not all reinforcers get their power the same way. Understanding where that power comes from is the key to this concept. Primary reinforcers work because of biology, not experience. They satisfy basic drives like hunger, thirst, and pain relief. So they reinforce behavior automatically from the very first encounter, no prior conditioning needed. The biological wiring behind this is the mesolimbic dopamine system. When a primary reinforcer is encountered, the ventral tegmental area fires dopamine toward the nucleus accumbens, tagging the behavior that produced that reward as worth repeating, all because of innate neural wiring. Secondary reinforcers like money and praise have no innate value. What? They acquire reinforcing power by being repeatedly paired with primary reinforcers. Money works because it buys food and shelter. Praise works because it has been paired with tangible rewards over time. When an exam stem describes a reinforcer that works without any prior learning and connects to a biological need, that is a primary reinforcer. When it describes value gained through pairing or association, that is a secondary reinforcer. Keep those two criteria sharp and the distinction is straightforward. Question 26. A college student studies vocabulary for a Spanish exam, then sits through a lecture in another class, then takes the exam the next morning. The vocabulary that she still recalls a day later has been stored in which type of memory? Your options are A. Sensory memory, B. Long-term memory, C. Short-term memory, D. Working memory. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is B. Long-term memory. B is correct because long-term memory stores a large amount of information for extended periods, ranging from hours to a lifetime, information that survives overnight and can still be retrieved the next day has been encoded into long-term memory rather than remaining in shorter stores. Is wrong because sensory memory holds perceptual impressions for a fraction of a second to a few seconds at most, far too briefly for next day recall. C is wrong because short-term memory holds information for roughly 15 to 30 seconds without rehearsal and has very limited capacity, so it cannot account for retention overnight. D is wrong because working memory is the active processing component used to manipulate information in the moment and relies on short-term stores rather than retaining information for hours. Classical memory theory recognizes three distinct stores: sensory memory, short-term memory, and long-term memory. Each differs dramatically in how long it holds information and how much it can contain. Sensory memory lasts only milliseconds, acting as a brief perceptual buffer. Short-term memory holds roughly 7 items for 15 to 30 seconds. Long-term memory has effectively unlimited capacity and can last a lifetime. It is what makes accumulated knowledge possible. The transition from short-term to long-term memory is called consolidation. The hippocampus plays a key role in the hours and days after an experience, but the memory itself ultimately becomes distributed across the cortex. Consolidation is strengthened when information is rehearsed, organized, emotionally significant, or elaborated. These processes produce lasting changes in neural connections, moving information out of temporary storage and into durable long-term memory. When a question describes information recalled the next day, retained for years, or retrieved after sleep, the concept is long-term memory. If information is only briefly held and actively manipulated, that points to short-term or working memory instead. Question 27. A grandfather tells his grandchildren about the day he first met their grandmother, including where they were, what the weather was like, and how he felt. Which type of memory is he drawing from? Your options are A. Semantic memory, B. Procedural memory, C. Episodic memory, D. Implicit memory. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is C. Episodic memory. C is correct because episodic memory stores personally experienced events with a specific time, place, and emotional context. Recalling the day of meeting his grandmother, including the setting and his feelings, is a textbook example of episodic memory. A is wrong because semantic memory stores general facts, meanings, and knowledge about the world that are not tied to specific events, such as knowing what a wedding ring symbolizes. B is wrong because procedural memory is a type of implicit memory for skills and habits, like riding a bike, not for narrative life events. D is wrong because implicit memory refers to unconscious memories that influence behavior without conscious recall, the opposite of consciously narrating a remembered event. Episodic memory is one of two major types of declarative memory. It stores personally experienced events complete with their time, place, and emotional context, giving you the feeling of having actually been there. Both episodic and semantic memory are explicit, meaning you can consciously recall and describe them. The key difference is content. Semantic memory holds facts like word meanings or historical dates, while episodic memory holds personally lived events, and it tends to fade more quickly with normal aging. The hippocampus and surrounding medial temporal lobe structures bind together the details of an event into one unified memory. The amygdala adds emotional intensity, which is why vivid or stressful experiences are so well remembered. Even after consolidation, episodic memories depend on the hippocampus for retrieval longer than semantic memories do. Every episodic memory carries three hallmarks: a specific time and place, a sense of personal experience, the feeling of having been there, an autobiographical context that links the event to your own life story. On exams, look for phrases like specific event, time and place, or personal recollection. These point to episodic memory. If the memory is unusually vivid and tied to a major emotional event, the more precise term may be flashbulb memory, a special subtype of episodic memory. Question 28. A woman who has not ridden a bike in 20 years gets on one and is able to ride down the street with only a few wobbles. She cannot verbally explain how she balances or pedals, but her body knows what to do. Which type of memory supports her ability? Your options are A. Implicit memory, B. Semantic memory, C. Episodic memory, D. Sensory memory. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is A. Implicit memory. A is correct because implicit memory operates outside of conscious awareness and includes procedural memory for skills and habits. Riding a bike automatically without being able to explain the steps relies on this non-declarative form of memory. B is wrong because semantic memory stores general facts and concepts that can be consciously stated, such as definitions of words, which is different from skills that cannot be verbally described. C is wrong because episodic memory stores specific events tied to time and place, not the motor skill of riding a bike that persists across decades. D is wrong because sensory memory retains brief perceptual impressions for only seconds and cannot account for a skill recalled 20 years later. Implicit memory is the kind of memory that works automatically outside of conscious awareness. Unlike explicit memory, it can't be put into words. Your brain and body simply know what to do. Implicit memory covers three main categories: procedural skills like riding a bike or typing, conditioned responses like flinching at a sudden sound, and priming, where earlier exposure influences behavior without the person knowing why. The brain structures behind implicit memory are distinct from those supporting explicit recall. The cerebellum handles motor coordination, the basal ganglia support habit learning, and the amygdala underlies conditioned emotional responses, none of which require the hippocampus. The key distinction for exams is this: explicit memory involves conscious recall and verbal description, while implicit memory operates without awareness and cannot be put into words. If a question describes someone performing a skill they can't explain, that's implicit memory. Whenever a STEM describes automatic behavior, a skill that can't be verbalized, or a learned response the person doesn't consciously remember acquiring. Implicit memory is the concept being tested, not semantic, not episodic. Question 29. A woman is in a serious car accident and survives, but afterwards she cannot recall most events from the months before the crash. Her memory for new events after the accident remains intact. Which type of amnesia best describes her condition? Your options are A. Functional amnesia, B. Anterograde amnesia, C. Infantile amnesia, D. Retrograde amnesia. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is D. Retrograde amnesia. D is correct because retrograde amnesia is the loss of memories formed before a brain injury or stressful event, while the ability to form new memories afterward remains intact. The pattern of losing pre-accident memories but retaining post-accident memory ability fits retrograde amnesia. A is wrong because functional amnesia arises from psychological trauma rather than physical brain damage and is rare. It would not be the default explanation after a car accident. B is wrong because anterograde amnesia involves the inability to form new memories after an injury, the opposite of the pattern described. C is wrong because infantile amnesia is the inability of most adults to recall events from before age 3 or so, and has nothing to do with adult brain injury. Retrograde amnesia is the loss of memories formed before a brain injury or traumatic event, while the ability to form new memories afterward remains intact. Understanding why this happens requires looking at how memories are consolidated over time. The key exam distinction is the direction of loss relative to the injury. Retrograde reaches backward. The person loses access to memories from before the event. Anterograde reaches forward. New memory formation is blocked, but the past is preserved. The hippocampus and medial temporal lobe structures drive memory consolidation at some uki, the gradual transfer of memories into stable cortical storage. Memories that are still being consolidated are vulnerable to disruption. Older, fully consolidated memories are stored independently of the hippocampus, which is why they tend to survive injuries that erase more recent ones. 3 features define the retrograde pattern. Memory loss is restricted to the period before the injury. New learning after the injury is unaffected. And there is a temporal gradient. The most recent memories are lost first while older. Well-consolidated memories are more likely to survive. A common confusion is between retrograde amnesia and infantile amnesia. Infantile amnesia is the universal inability to recall events from before age 3, caused by an immature hippocampus. No injury required. Retrograde amnesia, by contrast, involves the loss of memories that previously existed, always tied to a specific injury or trauma. Question 30. A student studies while listening to upbeat music and then takes the exam in a quiet classroom. She notices her recall is poorer than expected. A friend suggests that her memory might be linked to the emotional or physical state she was in while studying. Which memory phenomenon does this best illustrate? Your options are A. Interference, B. State-dependent retrieval, C. Encoding failure, D. Recency effect. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is B. State-dependent retrieval. B is correct because state-dependent retrieval refers to the finding that information is better recalled when the person is in the same physical or emotional state as when the information was learned. The mismatch between studying with music and testing in silence would reduce retrieval cues, explaining poorer recall. A is wrong because interference involves competing memories blocking each other, such as new information disrupting old or old disrupting new, which is not the mechanism described. C is wrong because encoding failure occurs when information was never fully entered into long-term memory in the first place, but the question implies the material was learned, just hard to retrieve. D is wrong because the recency effect describes superior memory for the last few items in a list, unrelated to the match between learning and testing conditions. State-dependent retrieval is the principle that memory works better when your internal state at recall matches your internal state at encoding. This goes beyond simply storing information. It's about the conditions under which you can find it again. When you form a memory, your brain encodes more than just the content. It also tags the memory with your mood, your arousal level, and any substance affecting you at the time. These state cues become part of the memory's address, and matching them at retrieval makes the memory easier to locate. The mechanism works through associative networks. A memory is linked to the cues present at encoding, and when those cues are reactivated at retrieval, they pull the target memory along with them. The closer the match between encoding and retrieval states, the stronger the activation. The key exam distinction is internal versus external. State-dependent retrieval involves internal conditions like mood, arousal, or substances in the body. Context-dependent retrieval involves external surroundings like the room, smells, or background sounds. Both fall under encoding specificity, but the source of the mismatch determines which concept applies. Whenever a test stem describes recall, that depends on matching a person's emotional or physiological state. State-dependent retrieval is the concept at work. The mismatch doesn't have to be large to matter. Even partial state reinstatement improves recall. Question 31. A psychology professor explains that in Freudian theory, one personality structure houses the individual's sense of right and wrong, internalized from parents and culture, and pushes the person toward moral behavior. Which structure is being described? Your options are A. Id, B. Ego, C. Superego, D. Unconscious. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is C. Superego. C is correct because the superego houses the individual's internalized sense of morality, drawn from parental teachings and cultural rules. Its job is to enforce ethical standards and to inhibit the inappropriate sexual and aggressive impulses of the id. A is wrong because the id operates on the pleasure principle and demands immediate gratification of basic drives, without regard for morality or consequences. B is wrong because the ego is the mediator that balances the demands of the AD, the superego, and reality. It is governed by the reality principle, not by moral standards. D is wrong because the unconscious is a level of awareness rather than a personality structure. The id resides mostly in the unconscious, but the unconscious itself contains thoughts and feelings of all kinds, not a moral compass. Freud proposed that personality isn't a single unified mind, but a system of three interacting structures, and the id, the ego, and the superego. Understanding how each one operates is the key to answering any question about his model. The T, present from birth, houses raw drives like hunger and aggression and demands immediate gratification. The superego develops in childhood as internalized moral standards, rewarding compliance with pride and punishing violations with guilt. The ego sits between them, using the reality principle to find workable compromises. Each structure has a distinct role. The id is impulsive and amoral. The superego is the conscience and moralizer. The ego is the negotiator and reality checker, balancing the demands of both. Exam questions signal the id with phrases like immediate gratification and basic drives. The superego appears with words like conscience, guilt, and internalized values. The ego is signaled by balance and mediating demands. Don't confuse the superego with the conscious mind. The superego is specifically about morality, not general awareness. Freud's lasting contribution was the idea that inner conflict is normal. Xasoimdia, not a flaw, but a feature of how the mind works. The tension among id, ego, and superego explains why people so often feel torn between desire, duty, and reality. Question 32. A therapist works from the belief that her client has the internal resources for growth and that her job is to provide acceptance without conditions, allowing the client to develop a healthy self-concept. Which theorist's framework is she applying? Your options are A. Carl Rogers, B. Sigmund Freud, C. Albert Bandura, D. B.F. Skinner. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is A. Carl Rogers. A is correct because Carl Rogers developed client-centered therapy and emphasized unconditional positive regard, the practice of accepting clients without conditions. He believed that this acceptance frees clients to develop a congruent, fully functioning self-concept. B is wrong because Sigmund Freud focused on uncovering unconscious conflicts and used techniques like dream analysis and free association rather than unconditional acceptance. C is wrong because Albert Bandura is associated with social learning theory and the concept of self-efficacy, not with humanistic therapy or unconditional positive regard. D is wrong because B.F. Skinner is a behaviorist who used reinforcement and punishment to shape behavior and did not endorse a therapeutic stance based on acceptance. Carl Rogers founded humanistic psychology and developed client-centered therapy, built on the belief that every person has an innate drive toward growth. His approach stood apart from both psychoanalysis and behaviorism, which he felt were too directive and too distrustful of the client's own capacity for insight. Rogers identified three conditions necessary and sufficient for therapeutic growth: unconditional positive regard, the acceptance of the client without judgment, empathic understanding, grasping the client's experience from the inside, and congruence, the therapist's authentic presence free from professional posturing. Unconditional positive regard is frequently misunderstood. It does not mean approving of every choice the client makes. It means accepting the client's worth as a person unconditionally, so she feels safe enough to lower her defenses and explore her own experience honestly. The most common exam confusion is between Rogers and Maslow, both humanistic thinkers. Maslow is linked to the hierarchy of needs with self-actualization at the top. Rogers is linked to client-centered therapy and the therapeutic stance of unconditional positive regard. If the STEM describes non-judgmental acceptance in a clinical setting, the answer is Rogers. Question 33. A personality researcher uses the most widely accepted modern trait model, which captures personality along 5 broad dimensions remembered with the mnemonic OCEAN. Which dimension reflects an individual's tendency to be organized, dependable, and self-disciplined? Your options are A. Openness, B. Extraversion, C. Agreeableness, D. Conscientiousness. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is D. Conscientiousness. D is correct because conscientiousness in the Big Five model captures traits like competence, order, dutifulness, achievement striving, deliberation, and self-discipline. A person who is organized and dependable is high on this dimension. A is wrong because openness reflects fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, and willingness to try new ideas or experiences, not organization or dependability. B is wrong because extraversion captures warmth, gregariousness, assertiveness, and excitement seeking, which relate to social energy rather than disciplined organization. C is wrong because agreeableness includes trust, altruism, compliance, and tender-mindedness. It concerns how one treats others rather than personal organization. Conscientiousness is one of 5 broad personality dimensions in the Big Five model, a framework researchers developed by using factor analysis to reduce thousands of trait words down to a small, replicable set of core dimensions. The 5 dimensions are openness, conscientiousness, extraversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, remembered with the acronym OCEAN. These dimensions emerged consistently across studies and cultures and became the standard model in personality research by the 1990s. Conscientiousness captures a person's tendency toward organization, dependability, self-discipline, and goal-directed behavior. People high in this trait plan ahead, follow through on commitments, and resist impulses that could interfere with long-term aims. Each Big Five dimension is a continuum. At the low end of conscientiousness, a person tends to be impulsive and unreliable. At the high extreme, they may become rigid and perfectionistic. Most people fall somewhere in the middle, and scores tend to rise modestly with age as adults take on greater responsibilities. A common exam pitfall is confusing conscientiousness with agreeableness. Conscientiousness signals organization, reliability, and goal pursuit, while agreeableness signals kindness, trust, and cooperation. The two are statistically distinct. Match the trait cluster in the STEM to the correct dimension. Question 34. A psychology textbook describes a trait model proposing that personality can be captured by only 3 super factors rather than 5. Extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Which theorist proposed this 3-factor approach? Your options are A. Raymond Cattell, B. Hans Eysenck, C. Gordon Allport, D. Carl Rogers. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is B. Hans Eysenck. B is correct because Hans Eysenck proposed that personality is best captured by 3 super factors: extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. He argued that this smaller number captured the most important dimensions and tied them to biological underpinnings such as cortical arousal, A is wrong because Raymond Cattell proposed 16 basic personality factors derived through factor analysis, a larger and more detailed model than Eysenk's 3. C is wrong because Gordon Allport is known for his trait theory distinguishing cardinal, central, and secondary traits, not for a 3-factor model. D is wrong because Carl Rogers worked within the humanistic tradition and focused on self-concept and unconditional, positive regard rather than trait factor models. Hans Eysenck proposed a more parsimonious alternative to the Big Five, arguing that personality can be fully captured with just 3 biological superfactors rather than 5 traits. The 3 dimensions are extraversion, neuroticism, and psychoticism. Extraversion and neuroticism overlap with the Big Five, but psychoticism is unique to Eysenck's model and has no direct counterpart elsewhere. Eysenck grounded each dimension in biology. Extraversion reflects cortical arousal levels. Neuroticism reflects how easily the autonomic nervous system triggers stress. And psychoticism captures tendencies toward impulsive and socially deviant behavior. Eysenck believed genetic and biological differences set each person's position on these 3 dimensions early in life. Environment then shapes how those dispositions are expressed in actual behavior. The simplest way to distinguish the 2 models, Eysenck has 3 dimensions including psychoticism, while the Big Five has 5 dimensions using the Ocean mnemonic. If a question mentions 3 superfactors or psychoticism, think Eysenck. Question 35. A new mother notices that her infant son has been calm and easy to soothe from birth, while her friend's baby is irritable and difficult to calm. A pediatrician explains that these inborn tendencies, present from very early in life and rooted in biology, are referred to by which term? Your options are A. Personality, B. Self-concept, C. Temperament, D. Cognitive style. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is C. Temperament. C is correct because temperament refers to inborn dispositions to think, feel, and behave in certain ways that emerge very early in life and have a strong biological basis. These early tendencies, such as easygoing versus irritable, shape later personality but are not the same as the full adult personality. A is wrong because personality is the broader, more enduring pattern of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that develops over time and is shaped by temperament along with experience and culture. B is wrong because self-concept is a person's sense of themselves, including beliefs and self-evaluation, and is something that develops with cognitive maturity, not present at birth. D is wrong because cognitive style refers to characteristic ways of perceiving and processing information and emerges later in development, not as an innate infant disposition. Temperament and personality are related but distinct concepts. Understanding the difference is essential for developmental psychology. Temperament describes inborn dispositions that appear from birth, before upbringing or culture have had any chance to intervene. These differences have a strong genetic basis, influencing nervous system reactivity, stress responses, and emotional arousal. Researchers Buss and Plomin identified 4 heritable dimensions of temperament: sociability, emotionality, activity, and impulsivity. Each sits on a continuum, and a child's position on each is largely determined by genetics. Think of temperament as the foundation and personality as the structure built on top. Temperament provides the raw biological material. Experience, culture, and learning shape that material into the broader adult personality over time. When an exam stem describes a tendency that is inborn, biological, and present from birth in an infant, the answer is temperament, not personality. If the stem instead describes a broader adult pattern shaped by years of experience, personality is the relevant concept. Question 36. A man strongly believes that smoking is harmful, yet he continues to smoke a pack a day. He feels uncomfortable about the gap between his attitude and his behavior. Which concept best describes this discomfort? Your options are A. Cognitive dissonance, B. Fundamental attribution error, C. Self-serving bias, D. Belief in a just world. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is A. Cognitive dissonance. A is correct because cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort that arises when a person's attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors are inconsistent. The smoker who believes smoking is harmful but smokes anyway experiences a textbook example of this tension. B is wrong because the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to overemphasize internal causes for others' behavior while underestimating situational factors unrelated to internal attitude-behavior conflict. C is wrong because self-serving bias involves attributing one's own successes to internal causes and failures to external causes, which is about explaining outcomes rather than feeling tension between beliefs and actions. D is wrong because belief in a just world is the assumption that people get what they deserve, which has nothing to do with the discomfort produced by inconsistency between belief and behavior. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort we feel when our beliefs and behaviors contradict each other. Leon Festinger introduced this idea in the late 1950s, and it quickly became one of social psychology's most important frameworks. The dissonance itself is that moment of uncomfortable tension, not what the person does about it, but the raw awareness that something inside doesn't add up. Once discomfort arises, a person is motivated to reduce it. She can change her behavior, change her attitude, add new cognitions that justify the inconsistency, or trivialize the gap entirely, deciding the conflict simply isn't worth worrying about. The most common mix-up is with confirmation bias. Cognitive dissonance involves tension between your own beliefs and actions. Confirmation bias is about filtering outside information to match what you already believe, a completely different mechanism. Remember, the term cognitive dissonance names the discomfort itself. When a STEM describes someone feeling tension because her actions clash with her values, that's the concept being tested, not the strategy she uses to resolve it. Question 37. A psychology student is learning that attitudes consist of 3 components, often summarized as the ABC model. Which of the following best describes the C or cognitive component of an attitude? Your options are A. The tendency to act toward an object in a particular way, B. The emotional feeling associated with the object, C. The arousal level experienced when encountering the object, D. The beliefs or thoughts held about the object. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is D. The beliefs or thoughts held about the object. D is correct because in the ABC model, the cognitive component refers to the beliefs, thoughts, and knowledge a person holds about an attitude object. For example, beliefs about whether a political policy is fair or effective form the cognitive component of an attitude toward that policy. A is wrong because the tendency to act toward an object in a particular way is the behavioral component, the B in the ABC model. B is wrong because the emotional feeling associated with the object is the affective component, the A in the model. C is wrong because arousal level is a physiological reaction and is not one of the 3 components in the ABC framework of attitude structure. Attitudes are more complex than simple liking or disliking. The ABC model breaks any attitude into 3 distinct components, giving researchers a structured way to analyze how people relate to attitude objects like people, groups, issues, or products, the affective component is the emotional feeling towards the object, warmth, fear, admiration. The behavioral component is the predisposition to act, such as approaching or avoiding. The cognitive component is the set of beliefs and knowledge a person holds about the object. Consider a voter's attitude toward a candidate. Her feeling of warmth is affective. Her tendency to donate and vote is behavioral, and her beliefs about the candidate's policies are cognitive. All three components contribute to the overall attitude, and a change in any one can shift the others. On exam stems, emotional words signal the affective component, action words signal behavioral, and belief or knowledge words signal cognitive. Watch out for the common confusion. Cognitive dissonance is a separate concept about the discomfort of inconsistency. Crum date. It is not the same as the cognitive component of attitude structure. Question 38. A consumer carefully evaluates an advertisement for a new car by analyzing the safety ratings, fuel efficiency, and warranty details before deciding to purchase. According to the elaboration likelihood model, which route to persuasion is she using? Your options are A. Peripheral route, B. Central route, C. Mere exposure effect, D. Sleeper effect. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is B. Central route. B is correct because the central route to persuasion involves careful, deliberate evaluation of the content and quality of an argument. The consumer's focus on safety ratings, fuel efficiency, and warranty details reflects a logical analysis of the argument's substance. The hallmark of the central route. A is wrong because the peripheral route relies on superficial cues such as the attractiveness of the spokesperson or the catchiness of a slogan, not on careful evaluation of the message content. C is wrong because the mere exposure effect describes increased liking after repeated exposure to a stimulus and is a peripheral route mechanism, not the deliberate processing described. D is wrong because the sleeper effect refers to a delayed increase in the persuasive power of a low credibility source over time, which is not relevant to active evaluation of facts. The elaboration likelihood model, developed by Richard Petty and John Cacioppo, identifies two distinct paths through which people can be persuaded. The central route is the path defined by careful, deliberate engagement with the actual content of a message. The central route requires the recipient to be both motivated and capable of careful thinking. The peripheral route, by contrast, relies on surface-level cues, a celebrity spokesperson, a catchy slogan, or sheer repetition, rather than the quality of the reasoning. When elaboration is high, the recipient moves along the central route, actively assessing the strength of the arguments. When elaboration is low, persuasion travels the peripheral route, driven by cues unrelated to argument quality. The depth of processing determines which route is taken, because central route attitude change is grounded in deliberate thought. It tends to be durable and resistant to counter-arguments. A person who has carefully reasoned through a message has also stress-tested it. Weak arguments can actually entrench the original position by generating counter-arguments. Remember, comprehension is just understanding what a message says, but the central route goes further. It involves actively judging the quality and strength of the arguments. When a stem describes a recipient reasoning through evidence and weighing the message's logic, the concept being tested is central route persuasion. Question 39. A driver is cut off in traffic and immediately concludes that the other driver is rude and inconsiderate, without considering that the driver might be rushing to a medical emergency. Which cognitive bias is most likely at work? Your options are A. Fundamental attribution error, B. Self-serving bias, C. Belief in a just world, D. Confirmation bias. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is A. Fundamental attribution error. A is correct because the fundamental attribution error is the tendency to attribute others' behavior to internal traits, such as character flaws, while underestimating situational factors. Concluding the other driver is rude rather than considering an emergency is the classic pattern of this error. B is wrong because self-serving bias involves protecting one's own self-image by attributing successes internally and failures externally, which is about explaining one's own outcomes rather than judging others. C is wrong because belief in a just world is the assumption that people get the outcomes they deserve, often leading to victim blaming, not snap judgments about a stranger's character. D is wrong because confirmation bias is the tendency to seek out information that supports existing beliefs and is broader than the specific tendency to attribute others' behavior to internal traits. The fundamental attribution error describes a deep and pervasive bias in how we explain other people's behavior. Understanding it means understanding why our snap judgments about others are so systematically skewed. The error has two competing explanations for any behavior: dispositional ones like traits and character, and situational ones like context and circumstances. The bias is our strong tendency to reach for the dispositional explanation first, before we even consider the situational alternatives. The mechanism is an asymmetry of perspective. When you watch someone else, you see the person clearly, but the situation surrounding them is invisible. When you experience your own behavior, you have full access to your situation, the traffic, the deadline, the emergency. This asymmetry causes observers to overweight the person and underweight the situation. The most common exam confusion is between the fundamental attribution error and the self-serving bias. The fundamental attribution error is about how we explain other people's behavior, favoring internal trait attributions. The self-serving bias is about how we explain our own outcomes, crediting ourselves for successes and blaming external factors for failures. On the exam, look for a stem describing someone explaining another person's behavior in terms of character or personality while ignoring the situation. That pattern, observer, other person, trait explanation, is the signature of the fundamental attribution error. Question 40. After acing a chemistry exam, a student attributes her success to her own intelligence and hard work. After failing the next exam, she blames the test for being unfair and the professor for poor teaching. Which cognitive bias does her pattern of explanation illustrate? Your options are A. Belief in a just world, B. Fundamental attribution error, C. Confirmation bias, D. Self-serving bias. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Self-serving bias. D is correct because self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute one's own successes to internal factors like ability and effort while attributing one's failures to external factors like unfair tests or poor instruction. The student's pattern of explanations fits this bias precisely. A is wrong because belief in a just word is the assumption that people generally get the outcomes they deserve, not a pattern of selective attribution for one's own successes and failures. B is wrong because the fundamental attribution error refers to judgments about other people's behavior, not the asymmetric explanations a person makes about her own outcomes. C is wrong because confirmation bias is the tendency to seek information that supports existing beliefs, which does not specifically describe attributing personal success to internal causes and personal failure to external ones. The self-serving bias is a well-documented pattern in social psychology where people explain their own outcomes in ways that protect and enhance their self-esteem. The bias has two halves working together. Successes get attributed to internal causes like ability and effort, while failures get attributed to external causes like bad luck or unfair circumstances. Both halves must be present for the full self-serving bias. Picture a student who aces one exam and credits her intelligence and disciplined studying, then fails another and blames an unfair test, a confusing professor, and noise in the dawn. Her successes belong to her failures belong to the world. The most common confusion is with the fundamental attribution error. The self-serving bias concerns explanations of your own outcomes, while the fundamental attribution error concerns judgments of other people's behavior. If a question describes asymmetric personal success and failure explanations, that's self-serving bias, not FA. When you see someone consistently taking personal credit for wins and finding external explanations for losses, the self-serving bias is at work, maintaining self-esteem one attribution at a time. Question 41. A new employee notices that during team meetings, everyone seems to agree on a project direction she privately thinks is flawed. Worried about looking out of step with her colleagues, she nods along and adds her support. Which classic research finding does her behavior most closely echo? Your options are A. Milgram's obedience research, B. Ash's conformity research, C. Zimbardo's prison experiment, D. Bandura's Bobo doll study. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is B. Ash's conformity research. B is correct because Solomon Ash's conformity research demonstrated that people often agree publicly with a group's judgment, even when they privately believe the group is wrong, in order to avoid standing out. The new employee's behavior mirrors this normative social influence directly. A is wrong because Milgram's research investigated obedience to authority figures who instructed participants to harm others, not the pressure to agree with peers in a group setting. C is wrong because Zimbardo's prison experiment examined how assigned social roles can lead to abusive behavior, focusing on power dynamics rather than agreement under group pressure. D is wrong because Bandura's Bobo doll study demonstrated observational learning of aggressive behavior through modeling, which is unrelated to conforming to group opinion. Solomon Ash's classic conformity studies revealed something striking. Ordinary people will publicly agree with a clearly wrong group judgment just to avoid standing out. Understanding why this happened and how it differs from obedience is the core of this concept. In the experiment, a real participant sat among Confederates posing as fellow participants. Everyone was shown a target line and 3 comparison lines. The correct match was obvious, yet when all the Confederates confidently chose the wrong line, about 1/3 of participants conformed on each critical trial and 3/4 conformed at least once. 3 forces drive conformity: peer pressure from equals, the fear of standing out as the lone dissenter, and a social pull strong enough to override a person's own clear sensory judgment. No authority figure is needed. The group itself is the source of pressure. The critical distinction for exams is between Ash and Milgram. Ash studied conformity, changing behavior to match the judgment of peers and equals. Milgram studied obedience, following direct instructions from an authority figure. The source of the pressure tells you which concept applies. When an exam stem describes someone going along with a group of peers or agreeing with a clearly wrong consensus, think Ash and conformity. When it describes someone following orders from an authority, think Milgram and obedience. The source of the pressure is everything. Question 42. A research participant in a classic study is told by an experimenter in a white lab coat to administer increasingly painful electric shocks to another participant who is, in fact, a confederate. Despite hearing apparent distress, many participants continued delivering shocks. This study most directly examined which social psychological concept. Your options are A. Obedience to authority, B. Conformity to peer pressure, C. Group polarization, D. Social facilitation. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is A. Obedience to authority. A is correct because Stanley Milgram's research examined obedience to authority and found that a majority of participants continued to administer what they believed were painful shocks when instructed by an authoritative experimenter. The study highlighted how perceived legitimacy of authority can override personal moral judgment. B is wrong because conformity to peer pressure involves matching one's behavior to that of a group of equals. But in Milgram's setup, the pressure came from a single authority figure, not peers. C is wrong because group polarization is the tendency of group discussion to push initial opinions toward more extreme positions, which was not the dynamic in the one-on-one experimenter participant setup. D is wrong because social facilitation describes improved performance on simple tasks in the presence of others, an unrelated phenomenon that has nothing to do with following orders to harm. Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments, conducted at Yale in the early 1960s, remain among the most influential studies in psychology. Milgram wanted to understand how ordinary people could participate in atrocities, and what he found shocked the world. The setup placed a participant in the role of teacher, instructed to shock a learner for each wrong answer. The learner was actually a confederate, never truly shocked, but the teacher believed the shocks were real. A calm experimenter in a white lab coat directed the teacher to continue. Roughly 65% of participants delivered what they believed was the maximum 450-volt shock. Milgram showed that a legitimate seeming authority figure can override personal moral judgment, and that variables like the victim's proximity and the prestige of the location shifted obedience rates. The most common exam confusion is between Milgram and Ash. Milgram studied obedience to authority, following direct commands from a person in power. Ash studied conformity, matching the judgments of a peer group. If the STEM describes obeying a figure of authority, think Milgram. If it describes matching peers, think Ash. Milgram's enduring lesson is that ordinary people, not monsters, will follow orders from a legitimate authority figure, even when it means harming someone else. Recognizing this dynamic is central to understanding social influence. Question 43. A man collapses on a busy city sidewalk. Dozens of people walk past, each assuming someone else will call for help, and no one stops for nearly a minute. Which social psychological phenomenon best explains this delayed response? Your options are A. Social loafing, B. Group polarization, C. Bystander effect, D. De-individuation. Before I reveal it, which one do you think is right? The correct answer is C. Bystander effect. C is correct because the bystander effect describes the tendency for individuals to be less likely to offer help in an emergency when other people are present. As the number of apparent witnesses grows, each person assumes someone else will take responsibility, a process called diffusion of responsibility. A is wrong because social loafing refers to reduced individual effort when working as part of a group on a shared task, not the failure to help in an emergency. B is wrong because group polarization is the tendency for group discussion to push opinions toward extremes, which does not describe the failure of strangers to act. D is wrong because de-individuation refers to the loss of self-awareness in crowds, often leading to disinhibited behavior rather than inaction during an emergency. The bystander effect is one of social psychology's most counterintuitive findings. The more people present during an emergency, the less likely any single person is to help. More potential helpers often means less help, not more. The effect rests on two psychological processes. Diffusion of responsibility means each bystander assumes someone else will step in, spreading the obligation so thin that no one acts. Pluralistic ignorance means bystanders look to each other for cues, and when no one else reacts, each concludes the situation must not be a real emergency. Picture someone collapsing on a crowded sidewalk. Each passerby notices but glances at others for guidance. Seeing no one else react, they conclude it isn't serious. This chain of mutual inaction is the bystander effect playing out in real time. Exactly the dynamic studied after the 1964 Kitty Genovese case. The most common mix-up is with social loafing. Both involve reduced individual effort around others, but the contexts differ. The bystander effect applies to emergencies where helping fails. Social loafing applies to collaborative tasks where each member contributes less. If someone fails to help in a crisis, that's the bystander effect. When an exam stem describes a group witnessing an emergency while each person assumes someone else will act, the bystander effect is the concept being tested. The critical signals the combination of other people present and a failure to intervene. Question 44. A presidential advisory team is planning a major military operation. Several members privately have concerns about the plan but do not voice them, eager to maintain group harmony and avoid being seen as the lone dissenter. The plan goes forward and ends in disaster. Which group decision-making phenomenon does this illustrate? Your options are A. Group polarization, B. Groupthink, C. Social facilitation, D. The bystander effect. What's your answer? Commit to one before I continue. The correct answer is B. Groupthink. B is correct because groupthink occurs when the desire for harmony and conformity in a cohesive group overrides critical thinking, leading members to suppress dissent and reach faulty decisions. The advisory team's pattern of silent doubts and unanimous endorsement of a flawed plan is a textbook case. A is wrong because group polarization describes how discussion pushes opinions toward more extreme positions, not the suppression of dissent to maintain harmony. C is wrong because social facilitation refers to the boost in performance on simple tasks when others are present, an unrelated concept about individual task performance. D is wrong because the bystander effect concerns the diffusion of responsibility in emergencies, not group decision-making by an advisory team. Groupthink is a pattern of dysfunctional decision-making that emerges when cohesive groups prioritize harmony over critical thinking. It was named by Irving Janis in 1972 after studying real policy disasters, including the Bay of Pigs invasion. Several symptoms mark a groupthink-prone group. Members share an illusion of invulnerability and engage in collective rationalization, dismissing contradictory evidence. Pressure on dissenters leads to self-censorship, and an illusion of unanimity forms because no one voices objections. Together, these dynamics produce confident but poorly grounded decisions. Picture a tight-knit advisory team planning a major operation. The leader signals a preferred course. Members privately harbor doubts but stay silent, and each person reads the quiet room as consensus. Outside experts never enter the conversation. The group votes unanimously, and the decision fails. The key distinction to remember: groupthink produces a flawed consensus through suppressed dissent, while group polarization pushes members toward more extreme versions of their initial positions. A stem describing suppressed concerns points to groupthink. A stem describing radicalized opinions points to polarization. Groupthink is not simply conformity. It is a specific failure of group decision-making driven by cohesion, isolation, and the silencing of dissent. When a stem describes smart people reaching a clearly flawed unanimous decision, Groupthink is the concept at work. Question 45. A group of 5 college students is assigned a class project where the entire group receives the same grade. As the deadline approaches, 2 members find themselves doing most of the work while the others coast. Which phenomenon best explains the reduced effort by the coasting members? Your options are A. Group polarization, B. Conformity, C. The bystander effect, D. Social loafing. Pick one. Trust your gut. Here's your chance to test yourself. The correct answer is D. Social loafing. D is correct because social loafing is the tendency for individuals to exert less effort when working in a group on a shared task than they would working alone. When individual contributions are difficult to identify, some members reduce effort and rely on others to carry the load, exactly as described. A is wrong because group polarization describes the shift toward more extreme opinions after group discussion, not the reduction of individual effort on a shared task. B is wrong because conformity is changing one's behavior to match a group norm, which does not specifically explain reduced individual effort in collaborative work. C is wrong because the bystander effect refers to inaction during emergencies, not the reduction of effort on shared academic tasks. Social loafing is the tendency to exert less effort on a shared group task than you would working alone. The key mechanism is diffused accountability. When individual contributions are hard to identify, personal motivation drops. Max Ringelmann first documented this in the 1870s, observing that individuals pulling a rope exerted less force per person when in a group than when pulling alone. The shared task diluted each person's felt responsibility. Loafing grows when individual contributions can't be measured, when members assume others will pick up the slack, when the task feels unimportant, and when the group is large. Remove any of these conditions and effort tends to recover. Don't confuse social loafing with the bystander effect or social facilitation. Social loafing applies to collaborative work where output is the goal. The bystander effect applies to emergencies. Social facilitation actually improves performance on simple tasks done in front of others. When a question describes someone coasting on a group project while others carry the load, that's social loafing. The shared outcome has weakened individual accountability and effort quietly fades. Question 46. A patient has experienced at least 2 weeks of persistent sadness, loss of interest in usual activities, fatigue, and feelings of worthlessness. There is no history of manic or hypomanic episodes. Which DSM-5 diagnosis best fits this presentation? Your options are A. Major depressive disorder, B. Bipolar I disorder, C. Bipolar II disorder, D. Cyclothymic disorder. Which would you go with? Lock it in before the reveal. The correct answer is A. Major depressive disorder. A is correct because major depressive disorder is characterized by at least 2 weeks of depressed mood or loss of interest, along with several symptoms such as fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, and changes in sleep or appetite. The absence of manic or hypomanic episodes rules out bipolar diagnoses. B is wrong because bipolar I disorder requires at least 1 full manic episode lasting a week or more, which the patient has not experienced. C is wrong because bipolar II disorder requires both hypomanic episodes and depressive episodes, but the patient has no history of any elevated mood phases. D is wrong because cyclothymic disorder involves chronic hypomanic and depressive symptoms that do not meet the full criteria for bipolar I or Ts, but again, hypomanic features are required and absent here. Major depressive disorder, or MDD, is far more than ordinary sadness. It is a sustained, multi-system disturbance that does not resolve on its own and significantly interferes with daily life. The DSM diagnosis requires at least 2 weeks of either persistent depressed mood or loss of interest in nearly all activities, accompanied by symptoms like fatigue, feelings of worthlessness, poor concentration, and changes in sleep or appetite, all representing a clear change from the person's baseline. MDD arises from biological, psychological, and social factors working together. Biologically, neurotransmitter systems involving serotonin and norepinephrine are implicated, along with brain regions like the prefrontal cortex and amygdala. Psychologically, negative thinking and learned helplessness contribute, while social isolation and life stress often trigger or sustain episodes. 2 distinctions matter most on exams. MDD differs from dysthymia in duration and severity. MDD is intense but shorter. Dysthymia is milder but lasts 2 or more years. MDD also differs from bipolar disorders. MDD is unipolar, meaning mood disturbance is in the depressive direction only, with no history of manic or hypomanic episodes. When a clinical stem describes persistent sadness or loss of interest for at least 2 weeks, with no history of elevated or irritable mood, major depressive disorder is the diagnosis to reach for. Question 47. A man feels intense anxiety about contamination and repeatedly washes his hands, often for 30 minutes at a time, to reduce the distress. The washing behavior temporarily relieves his anxiety, but the cycle continues throughout the day. The repetitive hand washing is best classified as which feature of obsessive-compulsive disorder? Your options are A. An obsession, B. A delusion, C. A compulsion, D. A phobia. Don't overthink it. Which one feels right? The correct answer is C. A compulsion. C is correct because a compulsion is a repetitive behavior or mental act performed in response to an obsession, with the goal of reducing anxiety or preventing a feared event. The man's hand washing to relieve contamination fears matches the definition of a compulsion exactly. A is wrong because an obsession is an intrusive thought, urge, or image that triggers anxiety, such as the contamination fear itself, not the behavior performed to reduce that anxiety. B is wrong because a delusion is a fixed false belief, typically associated with disorders like schizophrenia, and does not describe the repetitive behavior the man performs. D is wrong because a phobia is an excessive fear of a specific object or situation that leads to avoidance, not a repetitive ritual aimed at reducing anxiety. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is defined by 2 interlocking features that feed into each other, creating a self-reinforcing loop. Understanding how obsessions and compulsions relate is the key to recognizing OCD on the exam. An obsession is the thought, intrusive, unwanted, and anxiety-producing. A compulsion is the action taken in response, aimed at reducing that distress. Crucially, both features must be present for a diagnosis of OCD. The mechanism is a cycle driven by negative reinforcement. The obsession triggers anxiety. The compulsion provides temporary relief. And because the relief is only temporary, the obsession returns and the compulsion must be repeated. Over time, both the obsessions and the dependency on compulsions grow stronger. OCD is distinct from related conditions. Generalized anxiety disorder involves broad worry without rituals. A phobia involves avoidance of a specific stimulus, not intrusive thoughts. A habit is routine behavior without significant anxiety driving it. Only OCD combines an intrusive thought with a ritualistic response. When a stem describes an intrusive, unwanted thought, that is the obsession. When it describes a repetitive behavior performed to reduce the stress caused by that thought, that is the compulsion. Spot the pairing and you have identified OCD. Question 48. A patient with schizophrenia reports hearing voices that no one else can hear and believes that government agents are tracking his movements. Which category of schizophrenia symptoms do these experiences represent? Your options are A. Negative symptoms, B. Cognitive symptoms, C. Affective symptoms, D. Positive symptoms. Got a guess? Lock it in. The correct answer is D. Positive symptoms. D is correct because positive symptoms of schizophrenia involve an addition or distortion of normal functions, including hallucinations such as hearing voices and delusions such as paranoid beliefs about being tracked. The label positive refers to the presence of unusual experiences, not to their being desirable. A is wrong because negative symptoms involve a loss or reduction of normal functions, such as flat affect, avolition, or social withdrawal, rather than the addition of hallucinations and delusions. B is wrong because cognitive symptoms refer to problems with attention, memory, and executive function, which are distinct from the perceptual and belief disturbances described. C is wrong because affective symptoms refer to disturbances in mood and emotional regulation, and are not the standard category used for hallucinations or delusions in the schizophrenia framework. Schizophrenia symptoms fall into two broad categories, positive and negative. These labels don't mean good or bad. They describe whether something is added to or taken away from normal experience. Positive symptoms represent things added to normal experience. The most testable examples are hallucinations, like hearing voices, and delusions, such as paranoid beliefs about being persecuted. Disorganized speech and behavior also fall here. Negative symptoms describe things taken away from normal functioning. Flat affect, avolition, anhedonia, and social withdrawal. These tend to respond less well to traditional antipsychotic medications than positive symptoms do. The underlying mechanisms differ between symptom types. Excess dopamine in the mesolimbic pathway is linked to positive symptoms, which is why dopamine-blocking antipsychotics reduce hallucinations and delusions. Reduced dopamine in the prefrontal cortex is associated with negative symptoms. On the exam, hallucinations and delusions signal positive symptoms of schizophrenia. Flat affect signals negative symptoms. Elevated mood and excessive energy signal manic episodes in bipolar disorder, a common mix-up. The word positive means something very different in each context. Question 49. A client with depression repeatedly tells her therapist that she is a complete failure because she did poorly on one work project. The therapist helps her examine and challenge this all or nothing thinking and replace it with more balanced, realistic thoughts. Which therapeutic approach is the therapist using? Your options are A. Psychodynamic therapy, B. Cognitive therapy, C. Behavioral therapy, D. Humanistic therapy. Which one is it? Pause the video if you need more time. The correct answer is B. Cognitive therapy. B is correct because cognitive therapy, developed by Aaron Beck, focuses on identifying and challenging cognitive distortions such as all or nothing thinking, then replacing them with more balanced, realistic thoughts. The therapist's approach of examining and reframing the client's distorted belief is the core technique. A is wrong because psychodynamic therapy explores unconscious conflicts and early childhood experiences rather than directly challenging current thought patterns. C is wrong because behavioral therapy focuses on changing maladaptive behaviors through conditioning techniques such as exposure or reinforcement, not on reframing thoughts. D is wrong because humanistic therapy emphasizes acceptance, self-exploration, and personal growth through unconditional positive regard rather than directly disputing distorted cognitions. Cognitive therapy is a structured, present-focused psychotherapy developed by Aaron Beck in the 1960s. It rests on the idea that distressing emotions are driven not by events themselves, but by the meaning we attach to them. Beck recognized that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are interconnected. By changing how a person thinks about a situation, you can change how she feels and ultimately how she acts. Thinking patterns can become distorted in predictable ways. The four most common distortions are all or nothing thinking, catastrophizing, mind reading, and overgeneralization, each causing emotional reactions out of proportion to reality. In practice, a cognitive therapist guides the client to examine an automatic thought, like "I am a complete failure," evaluate the evidence for and against it, and replace it with a more balanced, realistic conclusion. Distinguishing these therapies is a classic exam challenge. Cognitive therapy targets conscious thoughts. Behavioral therapy targets observable behavior. CBT combines both, and psychodynamic therapy digs into unconscious conflicts and childhood origins. Question 50. A psychiatrist prescribes a medication to treat a patient's major depressive disorder. The medication works by blocking the reabsorption of serotonin, making more of this neurotransmitter available at the synapse. Which class of medication is being prescribed? Your options are A. Benzodiazepines, B. Antipsychotics, C. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, D. Mood stabilizers. Take a second. Which answer would you pick? The correct answer is C. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. C is correct because selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, commonly abbreviated SSRIs, work by blocking the reabsorption of serotonin at the synapse, leaving more available for neural transmission. Common SSRIs include Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil, and they are first-line treatments for major depression. A is wrong because benzodiazepines such as Valium and Xanax enhance the effects of GABA and are used for short-term anxiety relief, not for treating depression by altering serotonin reuptake. B is wrong because antipsychotics primarily block dopamine receptors and are used to treat schizophrenia and severe mood disorders with psychotic features, not standard depression. D is wrong because mood stabilizers such as lithium are used to manage bipolar disorder by smoothing mood swings, not by selectively blocking serotonin reuptake. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are a widely used class of antidepressants. To understand why they work, we need to look at what happens inside the synaptic gap between neurons. Normally, after serotonin is released into the synapse and binds to the receiving neuron, the sending neuron reabsorbs it through a process called reuptake. SSRIs block this transporter, leaving more serotonin in the synaptic cleft to keep stimulating the postsynaptic neuron. The clinical benefit does not appear immediately. Over 4 to 6 weeks, elevated synaptic serotonin triggers downstream changes. Receptor sensitivity adjusts and gene expression shifts. And these adaptations are what actually produce the improvement in mood. SSRIs are often confused with similar classes. SNRIs target both serotonin and norepinephrine. Benzodiazepines act on the GABA system for short-term anxiety relief. Antipsychotics target dopamine receptors. When a question emphasizes selective blockade of serotonin reuptake alone, SSRIs is the answer. The defining feature of SSRIs is selectivity. They leave other neurotransmitter systems largely undisturbed, which is why they replaced older antidepressants. If a STEM says selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor or names drugs like fluoxetine or sertraline, SSRIs is the concept being tested.
You have reached the end of our first question set. For the free complete exam preparation, visit our website, link in the description, where you find thousands more practice questions and comprehensive study guides. Thanks for studying with us today. See you in the next video.